Good afternoon, everyone. Glad you're all able to make it today. Following the Feast of Tabernacles, it's been reported that several people in various Church of God fellowships have contracted the COVID-19 disease. We might ask, what does this mean in terms of risk of the disease and the consequences? Also, what's the best way to protect yourself? And we might ask why such alarm and hysteria concerning this particular disease. In today's sermon, I want to address these questions and continue our review of information about the COVID-19 disease and biblical principles regarding disease, faith, and protection. Some of what I hope to cover is a reiteration of information presented in the past, but I believe it's worth repeating and emphasizing. Let's ask if several thousand people went to the Feast of Tabernacles one year, and a dozen or even several dozen came down with the flu afterward. Would that make news? Would that be unusual? Would it even be noticed? Probably not. I don't know exactly how many people in various Church of God fellowships have become sick with COVID-19 or tested positive for COVID-19 since the Feast of Tabernacles or even before the Feast of Tabernacles. There were evidently people who observed the feast in several different locations, however, who became sick. But it's likely, whatever the number is, who have become sick with that particular disease, it's a small number compared to the total number who attended the feast in various locations. I don't know of any who have died of COVID-19 among those who've fallen sick. Time will tell if any does. It does seem to be true that the virus that causes COVID-19 is more contagious than many normal flu viruses, but it's not necessarily more deadly in terms of the death rate of those who contract the disease. So we need to keep it in perspective. Getting sick with COVID-19 is not an automatic death sentence by any stretch of the imagination. Most people, the vast majority of people who have tested for COVID-19 have not gotten sick, and studies indicate only a small percentage, less than 1% of those who contract the disease die from it. If you've been watching the news, you probably have heard that cases of COVID-19 are increasing by leaps and bounds. According to the website worldometers.info, coronavirus, as of October the 23rd, 2020, the number of cases of COVID-19 worldwide continues to climb, with the number of new cases reported on September 4th, 2020, for example, at 308,006. That's September the 4th, 2020. On that particular day, according to this particular website, there were reported 308,006 cases, new cases worldwide. The number of new cases reported on October 21st, 2020, which is not quite 2 months later, the number of new cases reported on October 21st were, on that particular day, 439,450. 308,006 on September the 4th, 439,450 on October the 21st, which is an increase of 131,384 new cases the one day as opposed to the other. That's a 43% increase of new cases reported on October 21st as opposed to new cases reported on September the 4th. Now, the number of new cases reported daily goes up and down all the time. One day it may be up quite a few, the next day it may be down, and so forth. It goes up and down constantly. And that's why you may read in headlines stories that seem to be saying opposite things, like number of new cases declines, number of new cases increases, and so forth. But both of those dates, September the 4th and October the 21st, represent a peak of reported new cases daily in the time period near them, and the time periods are the days near them. These were peak days in that general range of dates. So we have a dramatic increase, steady increase in new cases being reported on a daily basis. The number of deaths, however, being reported, according to the same website, has been fairly steady since April, with somewhat around 5,000 deaths per day being the average. The highest number of daily deaths reported by month occurred in April and then declined, and since that time has fluctuated somewhat from day to day and month to month, but the overall average has not changed dramatically. What this means is that more cases are being reported, but the death rate is dropping, the death rate being the number of deaths as compared to the number of cases. Or to state it another way, the number of cases reported daily has increased steadily, while the number of deaths reported per day has remained fairly steady on average from the end of April through to the last week of October, according to the charts on the website mentioned. Now, it should be noted that the number of deaths are actually very hard to pin down because of the sloppy and deceptive way in which deaths are being reported, but these numbers at least give us a rough indication of trends in the epidemic. What is really increasing is the number of people either testing positive for COVID-19 or someone deciding to include a person in the count of cases for some other reason. What is a case? How is that defined? According to Dr. Dan Erickson, and this is from an article entitled "Explosion in Mandatory Masking Isn't Driven by Science, by Fear," from LifeSiteNews.com on July the 27th. Dr. Erickson says a case is a person healthy that tested positive, the vast majority. But the public hears cases and thinks, oh my goodness, these are sick people. No, the vast majority, 99.8% of people get through this with little or no progressive or significant disease. The focus should not center on cases, he continued. Rather, the narrative should focus on hospitalizations and deaths that are appropriately coded on a death certificate, stressing appropriately coded. That reference to appropriately coded implies what many are now discovering, that is, the real number of deaths directly attributable to the Wuhan virus is likely hugely overstated for a variety of reasons. Brian Jundeff, MD, comments in an article he wrote entitled "Media Malpractice on COVID Numbers" from July 20th, 2020. He makes this statement, quote, "Context includes what defines a positive COVID test. Is it an actual positive antigen test result or a presumed positive case? Some counties in Texas were classifying a neighbor or coworker of a test positive case suffering from a cough or sore throat as having COVID even without an actual test. This could result in 10 to 20 additional reported positive cases based on only one actual case. Antibody test positive individuals having previous but not current active infections are also positive cases. That would be like classifying retired military members as active duty. Context also includes asking whether these individuals are symptomatic or not. We never test asymptomatic individuals or contacts of those with the seasonal flu. In fact, most with the flu treat it symptomatically until they get better and do not get tested unless they are sick enough to journey to the hospital. Asymptomatic individuals exposed to someone with the flu certainly don't get tested. Why then is there such a push for COVID testing? He asks. The New York Times published the following concerning testing, and this is from an article guess I forgot to write down the date of the article. Anyway, if you're interested, I can get that for you later. But anyway, the New York Times published the following concerning testing. It's a fairly recent article, by the way. They said, quote, "Some of the nation's leading public health experts are raising a new concern in the endless debate over coronavirus testing in the United States. The standard tests are diagnosing huge numbers of people who may be carrying relatively insignificant amounts of the virus. Most of these people are not likely to be contagious, and identifying them may contribute to bottlenecks that prevent those who are contagious from being found in time." The article went on to say in 3 sets of testing data that include cycle thresholds compiled by officials in Massachusetts, New York, and Nevada, up to 90% of people testing positive carried barely any virus, a review by the Times found. The article went on to state that based on their data, likely only 10% of the people who test positive for coronavirus were contagious. Dr. Jundev, whom I quoted earlier, also states, quote, "Not only are case numbers inflated, but also deaths. Anyone testing positive at the time of death is counted as a COVID death, from alcohol poisoning or a shooting to someone in hospice with weeks to live, dying from an underlying condition but testing positive. George Floyd is likely to be somewhere on the COVID death count as he tested positive at autopsy." That's from the previously mentioned article on July 20th, 2020. Why is it that some members of the Church of God have become sick with COVID-19? Why is it that some of the Church of God people have become sick? Is it true that if a person has faith in God, he will not get sick? Ought God always to protect people of the true faith from getting sick? Does God make such a promise? If you have faith, does that mean that you won't be infected with COVID-19 or perhaps other diseases? I've covered this subject in a general sense before in articles and sermons, but questions of this kind still come up for various reasons. In Psalm 91 and verse 10, we read, "No evil shall befall you, nor shall any plague come near your dwelling." No evil shall befall you, nor shall any plague come near your dwelling. Now, if some evil befalls you, or a disease, or some other disaster affects you, has God broken a promise? Is this an ironclad promise that a person of faith will never suffer adversity, never be a victim of evil, and never be sick, or a victim of some other disaster? What does this mean? There are times when God sends plagues of various kinds for punishment upon the wicked. In such situations, God may protect his own people from the plague. I say he may do that, as he did for the descendants of Israel in Egypt, when he set about to free them from slavery. Now, some of the plagues they were not protected from, but others they were. God sent a plague of hail upon Egypt because Pharaoh refused to yield to his commandments. And we read in Exodus 9, beginning with verse 23, Exodus 9, verse 23, Moses stretched out his rod toward heaven, and the Lord sent thunder and hail, and fire darted to the ground. And the Lord rained hail on the land of Egypt, so that there was hail and fire mingled with the hail, so very heavy that there was none like it in all the land of Egypt since it became a nation. And the hail struck throughout the whole land of Egypt, all that was in the field, both man and beast, and the hail struck every herb of the field and broke every tree of the field. Only in the land of Goshen, where the children of Israel were, there was no hail. So God sent this plague, one of 10, as you can read in the book of Exodus, on the Egyptians. And in this particular case, none of the hail fell on the land of Goshen where the people of Israel dwelt. Then there was finally the 10th plague, as we read in Exodus chapter 12, beginning with verse 12. Exodus 12 and verse 12, God told the people through Moses, he said, "For I will pass through the land of Egypt on that night," that was the Passover night, "and will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast. And against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. I am the Lord. Now the blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you are, and when I see the blood, I will pass over you. And the plague shall not be on you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt." So these are cases where God intervened directly or sent punishment on a people, but he spared others who found favor in his sight, and they were not affected by these particular plagues. But on the other hand, God gives no unconditional promise that in every case and at all times he will deliver the faithful from any particular evil. In fact, we are promised the exact opposite. We are promised that we will have various kinds of trials and difficulties in this life. Paul wrote to the Corinthians in 2 Corinthians chapter 6, beginning with verse 4, 2 Corinthians 6 and verse 4, he said to them, these were people in the church, "But in all things we commend ourselves as ministers of God in much patience, in tribulations, in needs, in distresses, in stripes, in imprisonments, in tumults, in labors, in sleeplessness, in fastings." Notice Paul was a minister. He's speaking of himself and the other ministers who had served the Corinthians. And he said to the Corinthians that we commend ourselves as ministers of God, men of faith, in much patience, tribulations, needs, distresses, stripes, imprisonments, tumults, labors, sleeplessness, and fastings. None of those necessarily pleasant experiences, although fasting can be a exercise in disciplining yourself to humble yourself before God, and not necessarily in the same category as some of these other things that he mentions. But none of these things is particularly pleasant, and they're not things one would normally wish on himself. We read of Paul in a ministerial journey to Asia Minor with Barnabas that he is described in the book of Acts. And in Acts chapter 14, verse 21, Acts 14, verse 21, it says, "And when they," that is Paul and Barnabas, "had preached the gospel to that city and made many disciples, they returned to Lystra, Iconium, and Antioch. These were cities that they had been through earlier preaching the gospel, and they had converts in these cities. So they returned through these cities on a return journey, Lystra, Iconium, Antioch, strengthening the souls of the disciples, exhorting them to continue in the faith, and saying, we must, through many tribulations, enter the kingdom of God. So he told the people, disciples who were in the faith, he said, continue the faith, and what you can expect is a lot of tribulations before you enter the kingdom of God. Paul wrote to the Thessalonians. He wrote to the Thessalonians in 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, beginning with verse 3. 2 Thessalonians 1 and verse 3, we are bound to thank God always for you, brethren, as it is fitting, because your faith grows exceedingly. These were people whose faith, according to Paul, as Paul perceived it, their faith was growing exceedingly. So evidently they weren't particularly weak in faith, just the opposite. He said their faith was growing exceedingly, and the love of every one of you all abounds toward each other. So these people were setting a fine example of Christian conduct, according to what Paul said in this letter. And he went on to say, so that we ourselves boast of you among the churches of God. Now, what was he boasting about? For your patience and faith in all your persecutions and tribulations that you endure. Here were people of faith whose love was abounding towards one another, and they were going through persecutions and tribulations that they had to endure. And their faith was manifested in enduring persecutions and tribulations. Satan quoted a passage from Psalm 91, the psalm we read earlier. He quoted a passage from Psalm 91 when he tempted Christ, as we read in Matthew chapter 4, beginning with verse 5. Matthew 4 and verse 5, the devil took him up into the holy city and set him on the pinnacle of the temple and said to him, if you are the Son of God, throw yourself down. For it is written, he shall give his angels charge over you, and in their hands they shall bear you up, lest you dash your foot against a stone. These are statements in Psalm 91. Jesus said to him, it is written again, you shall not tempt the Lord your God. Jesus understood there are times and circumstances under which he would be protected, and he was protected. And in like manner, we are often protected. I'm confident of that. But Jesus understood that for him to tempt God would not turn out well for him to do that. Because we have the experience of Israel in the wilderness as an example, along with many other experiences. But Israel in the wilderness tempted God. They provoked God with their complaints and their accusations when things didn't go according to their liking, when things got tough and difficult in the wilderness. In one occasion when they lacked water, they complained, tempting God. And so we read in Exodus 17 verse 7 of this particular location, that Moses called the name of the place Massah and Meribah because of the contention of the children of Israel and because they tempted the Lord, saying, is the Lord among us or not? That was their attitude. Moses called the place masa, which means temptation or trial, and meribah, strife. So they were going through a trial, and they entered into strife with God and with Moses. Job, we are told, was a righteous man. In Job 1 and verse 1, it says, there was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was blameless and upright, and one who feared God and shunned evil. So here was Job, a man of faith, an upright man, a man blameless, it says. Yet, to prove Job's faithfulness and humble him, God allowed him to suffer a series of catastrophic disasters, including a malady, as we read in Job 2 and verse 7, of painful boils from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. Painful boils. And this disease went on and on, evidently for an extensive period of time. Now, Job could not understand the reason for his suffering, and yet he did not waver in his faith. When his wife advised him, as we read in Job chapter 2 and verse 10, when she advised him, curse God and die, Job answered, you speak as one of the foolish women speaks. Shall we indeed accept good from God, and shall we not accept adversity? In all this, Job did not sin with his lips. Now, there isn't any one of us who has not received much good from God. We've all been recipients of many blessings, especially we here in this particular country and other nations, Western nations, particularly those descended from the various tribes of Israel, who have been among the most blessed people, if not the most blessed people in all of history. And we are still blessed despite our massive sins, which are mounting to heaven. But should we expect to receive all these blessings but never be willing to accept adversity? James wrote in James 5 and verse 13, is anyone among you suffering? Let him pray. Is anyone among you suffering? Let him pray. Now, if Christians are never supposed to suffer, why would James give us this admonition? James also wrote in James 5 verse 14, is anyone among you sick? Let him call for the elders of the church and let them pray over him, anointing him with oil in the name of the Lord, and the prayer of faith will save the sick, and the Lord will raise him up, and if he has committed sins, he will be forgiven. Now, if Christians are never supposed to get sick, why would James have written this? Why would he have written this if Christians are never supposed to get sick? There are many examples in Scripture of men and women of faith having various trials, which include, in some cases, sickness. Having faith in God does not necessarily imply you'll never be afflicted with sickness. Otherwise, the Bible makes no sense whatsoever. Having faith in God does not necessarily imply you'll never be afflicted with sickness. And there are many reasons a person of faith may become sick. A number of reasons. Sometimes it may be that God wants to try us or to humble us, as in the case of Job or Paul, who had an affliction of some kind that he realized helped him maintain a humble spirit. He wrote in 2 Corinthians 12, beginning with verse 7, 2 Corinthians 12 and verse 7, and lest I should be exalted above measure by the abundance of the revelations, a thorn in the flesh was given to me, a messenger of Satan to buffet me, lest I be exalted above measure. Concerning this thing I pleaded with the Lord 3 times that it might depart from me. And he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, most gladly I will rather boast in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. So along with all the other trials that Paul experienced during his lifetime, which were many, he suffered infirmities, serious enough that he prayed repeatedly that he be relieved of this particular one that he's referring to here. So that may be a reason for sickness. Sometimes we may become sick simply because our nature is weak and limited, subject to diseases and infirmities, as all flesh is. People in the church are not immune or exempt from natural laws. God created a world ruled by law, by cause and effect. And he created human beings with a nature that is corruptible. In other words, subject to disease, subject to decay, subject to illness. That probably is the primary reason that we get sick on occasion. Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 13, no temptation, or it could be translated adversity, no temptation or adversity or trial has overtaken you except such as is common to man. No adversity has overtaken you except such as is common to man. So look around you and see what other humans are experiencing in terms of adversity, and you may be subject to the same trials, the same difficulties, because you're human just as they are. He went on to say, God is faithful, who will not allow you to be tempted or tried beyond what you are able, but will with the temptation also make the way of escape that you may be able to bear it. Now the fact is, sometimes the way of escape may in fact be death, because we're all going to die eventually, unless we're alive when Christ returns and changed immediately into spirit. But we may become sick simply because we are human, and humans are subject by nature to infirmities, to sicknesses, and so forth. So where does faith come in? Godly faith does not consist of believing that God will never let you suffer, never let you get sick, or never experience adversity. A mature Christian should understand that you can experience any of these things, even if you are faithful and diligently seeking to please God. Part of exercising godly faith is learning how to manage our lives in such a way as to avoid unnecessary suffering. Not a little of the suffering that humans experience is brought on by themselves, by their own conduct or their misconduct. And part of godly faith is learning how to manage our lives in such a way as to limit or control suffering. As I mentioned, God created physical laws that rule the universe, that rule our flesh. that govern what occurs to and within our bodies, as well as the rest of the universe. If you violate those laws, you may become sick. I remember when I was younger, back in the 1950s, it was common for doctors to advertise cigarettes in commercials on television. Even though back then there was an awareness, which was steadily growing, that smoking was adverse to one's health, that it would cause disease. If you smoke long enough, it may cause you to develop cancer. It may cause you to develop heart disease. It may cause you to develop emphysema or other health problems. Eating the wrong foods or too much food may cause you to get sick with some of these same diseases. We read in Proverbs 23 and verse 21, Proverbs 23 and verse 21, for the drunkard and the glutton will come to poverty, and drowsiness will clothe the man with rags. What this tells us is that pursuing physical pleasures to excess has negative consequences, as do other unwise decisions or behaviors. And there could be many that we might mention. You know, like getting in your car and driving down the highway 100 miles an hour, or being careless in traffic, texting while you're driving down the highway. I was coming over here today and passing a semi-trailer, and the truck started wandering off into my lane as I was passing him. And he was a fair distance into my lane before he pulled back over after I honked my horn. I've seen, or my wife, usually it's not me that sees it, but if she's riding with me, a lot of times we'll be passing a truck and she'll be seeing the guy going like that on his phone or whatever while he's supposed to be driving a truck. That's a good way to have a wreck. In fact, there was a road sign on the way over here said, who you calling? Nobody. You're supposed to be driving. So, a lot of times we do things that bring sickness or other ills upon ourselves. On the other hand, making wise decisions helps us to avoid trouble. We read in Proverbs 3 and verse 13, happy is the man who finds wisdom and the man who gains understanding, for her proceeds are better than the profits of silver, and her gain than fine gold. She is more precious than rubies, and all the things you may desire cannot be compared with her. Length of days is in her right hand, and in her left hand riches and honor. Notice what it says. It says, understanding and wisdom can add days, perhaps years, to your life. It goes on to say in Proverbs 3, beginning in verse 21, Proverbs 3 and verse 21, keep sound wisdom and discretion, so there will be life to your soul and grace to your neck. Then you will walk safely in your way, and your foot will not stumble. So wisdom and discretion can be life to your soul. In other words, wisdom, knowledge, discretion, if applied properly, can preserve your life. Keep you from making disastrous mistakes. So let's put this in the context of protection from sickness and disease, particularly infectious diseases like COVID-19. As Christians, we must have faith. We must put our trust in God, that He will watch out for us and preserve us as He sees fit. And God does care for us, and He watches out for us. What He does not do is He does not guarantee us that we will never have problems in our lifetimes. God will do His part, and He will do it in the way that He sees fit, but we also must do our part to protect ourselves and others to the extent that we have any control over the situation that we may find ourselves in. This is a principle which applies broadly in many ways in our lives. Jesus said to His disciples and to us in Matthew 6 and verse 11, "Give us this day our daily bread." Give us this day our daily bread. Who do we rely on to bless us and provide our sustenance? According to Jesus, He said we need to ask God for our daily bread. So we ought to look to God to provide our sustenance. But is that all that we should do? Does that mean we need to get our plate and our fork and knife out and wait on God to serve us our breakfast, lunch, and supper? Don't we also have to work so that we may have the food that we need, assuming we're able to work? We read in 2 Thessalonians chapter 3 and verse 10, 2 Thessalonians 3 and verse 10, beginning with verse 10, Paul wrote, "For even when we were with you, we commanded you this, if anyone will not work, he shall not eat. For we hear that there are some who walk among you in a disorderly manner, not working at all, but are busybodies. Now those who are such we command and exhort through our Lord Jesus Christ that they work in quietness and eat their own bread." What this implies is that we not only ought to be praying for our daily bread, but we also ought to be working to make sure that we have it. God does His part. He's the one that sends the rain, the sunshine. He's the one that made all the different seeds that grow into plants that we can eat. He's the one that made the cows and the sheep or the chickens or whatever else we might be eating. And He also provides other blessings that make it possible for us to have food. But we have our part to play in the picture as well. He doesn't just do everything for us. Faith consists not only in trusting God for our provisions, but also using the energies and talents that He gives us to work to do our part to provide for our needs and the needs of others. James wrote in James chapter 2, beginning with verse 14, James 2 and verse 14, "What does it profit, my brethren, if someone says he has faith but does not have works? Can faith save him? If a brother or sister is naked and destitute of daily food, and one of you says to him, 'Depart in peace, be warmed and filled,' but you do not give him the things which are needed for the body, what does it profit? Thus also faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead. But someone will say, 'You have faith and I have works. Show me your faith without your works, and I will show you my faith by my works.'" if you don't have works, you don't have faith, at least not the kind that God requires. Now, just as this applies in the realm of our daily bread, it also applies in other respects, including avoiding sickness. There are things that we can do and that we should do to protect ourselves from becoming ill, and also to help protect others from becoming sick as we exercise faith in doing so. What are some of the things that we can do? Well, one of the things is sanitation. The Bible says a lot about cleanliness and sanitation. It might be a good exercise sometime to look up in a concordance the words wash, washing, clean, cleansing, and so forth. You'll find those words mentioned many times throughout the Scriptures. Washing and being clean are concepts that are given a lot of attention in the Bible, both in a physical sense and in a spiritual sense. In 2 Corinthians 7 and verse 1, we read 2 Corinthians 7 and verse 1, "Therefore, having these promises, beloved, let us cleanse ourselves from all filthiness of the flesh and spirit, protecting holiness in the fear of God." Cleanse ourselves from all filthiness of the flesh and spirit. Now, this could apply in a spiritual sense in terms of cleansing ourselves from sins, but it also can apply to dirt or things which cause disease. Diseases are often spread by unclean practices, such as not washing after using the bathroom. That's one of the ways in which COVID-19 is spread. It's not the major way, but it's one way in which it can be spread. Another way that we can be affected by uncleanness in terms of disease is eating or drinking contaminated foods or the wrong kinds of foods, or eating out of unclean utensils or similar practices. And it is a scientific fact that soap and water together are capable of killing virtually any virus or bacteria. So one of the principal words of advice given to us by health experts in connection with COVID-19 as well as many other diseases is to wash your hands with soap and water. Several times a day, particularly when they have been where they could pick up harmful germs that could make you sick. There's an article posted on our website called Natural Antibiotics, and there are links on that article to various websites, some of which are links to health advice from certain medical organizations on measures you can take to help prevent getting sick with a viral disease. Some of the things that they mention there, and if you haven't taken a look at those links, I would recommend that you do so. But some of the things they mention is a healthy diet, eating foods that are good for your health, that help build your immunity, your natural immunity. They also recommend getting enough rest, trying to avoid too much stress in your life, which can weaken your immunity. They mention a number of substances, which I'll get to in a minute, that can help you avoid getting sick. Another thing that you can do is having a covering over your mouth when near other people if you are sick. We discussed that in a previous sermon. And a covering, when you are near people, when you're very near people, may have some effect in limiting the spread of contaminated droplets if you should happen to cough or sneeze or perhaps talk to the person that you are near. Actually, this works better if you're at a distance, because the mouth covering with the distance that you maintain from another person who is not sick work together to limit the exposure of the other person. This is a biblical principle, as we've seen earlier. On the other hand, wearing a mask or a face covering, if you are not sick, does not offer much, if any, protection against a viral disease, because viruses can easily penetrate a cloth mask or even a surgical mask, and that's not speculation, that's a matter of fact. This is from this. I'm going to read remarks from an article entitled Masks-Science from the website americasfrontlinedoctors.com. This is a group of doctors that have put this website up, mainly dealing with COVID-19, and issues regarding it. This is what this article says: masks do not prevent virus respiratory illness. Size matters. Viruses are 50 times smaller than bacteria and 1,000 times smaller than a hair. In other words, if you had a hair, the width of a hair, you could fit 1,000 viruses across that hair. A bacteria is about 5 micrometers. The size of particles in wood smoke in a wildfire range from about 0.4 to 0.7 micrometers or micrometers. And so you have a bacteria about 5 micrometers, particles in wood smoke 0.4 to 0.7 micrometers, or an average of about 0.5, half of a micrometer. The size of a virus, and there are different sizes for different viruses. They range in size depending on the virus, but a influenza or SARS-CoV-2 virus, which is the COVID-19 virus, those viruses average about 0.1 micrometers. 0.1 micrometers. So they are much smaller than the size of particles in wood smoke. And according to the Centers for Disease Control, cloth masks do not catch small, harmful particles in smoke. They will go right through the mask, and they are larger than the viruses. Quoting a study of cloth masks, this same source says, quote, penetration of cloth masks by particles was 97%, and medical masks 44%. So 97% of the viruses got through the cloth masks and 44% through the medical masks. Goes on to say moisture retention, reuse of cloth masks, and poor filtration may result in increased risk of infection. The virus may survive on the surface of the face masks. self-contamination through repeated use and improper doffing is possible. A contaminated cloth mask may transfer pathogen from the mask to the bare hands of the wearer. Cloth masks should not be recommended for healthcare workers, particularly in high-risk situations, and guidelines need to be updated. Their conclusion is that wearing masks will not reduce SARS-CoV-2 infections. N95 masks, which are a special expensive and designed mask specifically to filter out harmful organisms. N95 masks protect healthcare workers but are not recommended for source control transmission. And there are a number of reasons for that. Number one, they're very expensive. And also, most people who have a disease will not know how to wear one properly or will not wear one properly, even if they had it. Surgical masks are better than cloth masks, but they're not very efficient at preventing emissions from infected patients. That's why even if you're wearing a mask and you're sick, you still need to maintain distance from other people, as the Bible itself indicates. Cloth masks will be ineffective at preventing SARS-CoV-2 transmission, whether worn as source control or as personal protective equipment, according to this source. And they go on to say masks may confuse that message and give people a false sense of security. If masks had been the solution in Asia, where mask wearing is quite common, shouldn't they have stopped the pandemic before it spread elsewhere? So I don't have the quotation here, but they also mention that mask wearing has almost become kind of a talisman, kind of a symbol of someone's idea that they're doing something to fight a disease, when in most cases what they're doing is having little or no effect whatsoever, but it makes them feel good. And it gives a false sense of security in many cases. So I'm not telling you to wear a mask or not wear a mask, except I strongly advise you to wear one if you're sick and you're around other people. That is, put some kind of a covering over your mouth, at least. But if you're not sick, the more I've studied this from various sources, the less sense it makes, at least in terms of viruses. Now, one of my daughters sent me an email about how some people wore masks during the Middle Ages when they were robbing bodies of people who had died of the plague, and they weren't just wearing masks, they were also more or less bathed in spices and essential oils. And since bacteria are much larger than viruses, masks could be significantly more effective in filtering a bacteria than it would a virus. But also, those spices and essential oils were were in effect antibiotics, and the plague is the bubonic plague is a result of a bacterial organism. So I'm not saying there are no cases where masks might not be appropriate. There could be some situations, and masks are commonly worn in rooms where surgery is being performed and things of that sort, mainly to keep body fluids from being absorbed or transmitted from one person to the other, things of that sort. But you can make your decision on that. I'm just telling you what these sources say that have studied this rather in depth. As far as I'm concerned, the bottom line is that covering your mouth if you are contagious may offer some limited protection from spreading disease, but probably not in close contact with others. That's why the Bible also tells the leper to stand apart, keep his distance from other people, be separated. By the way, I might mention that the word leper, as it's used in I believe it's Leviticus 13 and 15 and other scriptures, is not limited to a particular disease. It is a term, the Hebrew term actually is not leper, that's from the Greek, but it is describing according to many commentators, it's describing a range of communicable diseases that are that include skin lesions and so forth. Also, the word leper is used of in the English translation, the same word in the Hebrew that's translated leper is used of fungal and growth or mold growth, toxic mold on the walls of houses or on pieces of cloth that people might wear or sit on and things of that sort. So it's not limited to some specific disease. And in principle, it would apply to other infections that may not necessarily involve skin lesions, although many infectious diseases like measles and smallpox and others involve skin lesions and similar eruptions on the skin. But I see no practical reason for a person who is not sick to be wearing a face covering or mask under most circumstances. That's my personal opinion, and I'm sure you have your personal opinion. You're entitled to it. Okay, what else can be done besides the things that we mentioned? I think it's very significant. I've read a number of articles. I've read many articles about this COVID-19 disease. And I've noticed something that is quite common in most of the sources that I've looked at, especially by that are supposed to represent so-called expert opinion. And that is an important measure is that you can take is being ignored by most of the mainstream media and so-called experts. And that is the use of prophylactics to avoid getting sick, which is one of the main things that they ought to be telling us about. Things that you can do, that you can take, measures you can take to avoid getting sick. And they say virtually nothing about those. In fact, some websites say there's nothing you can do, nothing you can take that will help you avoid getting sick, which is a lie. A definition of a prophylactic, according to the 1913 Webster's Dictionary, is, quote, a medicine which preserves or defends against disease, a preventative. Something you do to prevent a disease. This is the term in which this is the way in which I'm using this term. And there are a variety of herbs, minerals, vitamins, and some pharmaceutical medicines that can help prevent infection by viruses or bacteria, or help in other ways to fight off infection. And many of these are well known by at least certain types of medical practitioners, as well as others who have studied medicinal herbs and such things. Some of them include, for example, vitamin D, vitamin C, curcumin, which is an ingredient in turmeric, elderberry, zinc, colloidal silver, calendula, olive leaf, berberine containing herbs such as Oregon grape, coconut oil, and others too numerous to mention. For a number of years, I have personally taken on a daily basis a certain quantity of olive leaf powder, vitamin D, an allicin tablet, which is the equivalent of each tablet, essentially the equivalent of a clove of garlic, several of them a day. And certain other herbs or substances to avoid getting sick. Colloidal silver is one as well. Sometimes I eat a tablespoon of coconut oil. Coconut oil is antibacterial and antiviral. In fact, it's being studied in the Philippines for its efficacy in treating or killing the COVID-19 virus. It's known to be effective against other viruses, as well as bacteria and so forth. And the Philippines, where much of the world's supply of coconut oil comes from, in the Philippines, coconut oil is widely consumed. And in a comparison with their population, which is about 110 million people, compared with that of the United States on a basis of so many deaths per million, their death rate from COVID-19 is about 20% of that in the United States, their reported death rate. Now, whether that's due to coconut oil consumption alone or other things, no one probably knows except God. But it is interesting that in a country where coconut oil is a regular part of the diet, the death rate from the COVID-19 virus is only about 1/5 of what it is in this country. An effective preventative and treatment medication is hydroxychloroquine, which is derived from quinine, which is a natural substance. Hydroxychloroquine is a medication that's been used for 50 or 60 years as a preventative for malaria, and it is also used for lupus and some other diseases. But an interesting thing has happened in the course of this epidemic. The so-called mainstream media, certain elements of the medical establishment, politicians, and powerful corporate interests have done everything possible to demonize and dismiss the use of hydroxychloroquine to treat COVID-19. And they've done this over the protests of many medical practitioners and research scientists. Media companies such as Google, Facebook, Twitter, and others have tried to block information from being readily available concerning the efficacy of hydroxychloroquine. In an article entitled "We have a treatment, hydroxychloroquine, we do not need a vaccine," Dr. Pascal Sacra wrote, quote, "We have a treatment in COVID-19 and it doesn't have the support of Big Pharma and their experts." Notice he says it does not have the support of Big Pharma and their experts. Hydroxychloroquine is effective in treating COVID-19. It is effective in halting the progression of the disease, provided it is given early enough and provided it is given in accordance with contraindications and safety of use. And by the way, it's one of the most safest medicines there is in the pharmacopoeia of the world. It costs nothing. It actually doesn't cost nothing, but it costs almost nothing. A few cents a tablet, I think. It costs nothing, and the powerful pharmaceutical industry does not want to hear about it. Big Pharma has done everything to outlaw and demonize it, including the publication in the most prestigious medical journal, Lancet, of a fraudulent article written 12 days, which was withdrawn 12 days later. Actually, there have been several fraudulent articles about fraudulent tests of this medicine on the COVID-19 virus, which have been designed to claim that it is not only not effective, but dangerous and kills people. If you've read any of those articles, they're lies, and they're deliberate lies. He goes on to say, let's stop saying that there is no treatment for COVID-19 or that only a vaccine will save us. There is a treatment for this disease, not in intensive care where it may be too late, but to prevent it from going to intensive care. So to be given early enough by general practitioners or emergency doctors. The key to defeat COVID-19 already exists. We need to start using it. Harvey Risch, MD, PhD, is professor of epidemiology at the renowned Yale University School of Public Health. And this is a statement, this is being quoted in this article by the other doctor I mentioned. Harvey Risch, who has written several articles on this subject, states here, as professor of epidemiology at the Yale School of Public Health, I've authored more than 300 peer-reviewed publications and currently hold leadership positions on the editorial boards of several leading journals. I'm used to advocating positions within the medical establishment, so I was disconcerted to find that in the midst of a crisis, I had to fight for a treatment that was fully supported by the data, but for reasons unrelated to a proper understanding of the science was sidelined. As a result, tens of thousands of COVID-19 patients are dying needlessly. Fortunately, the situation can be reversed easily and quickly. I'm talking, of course, about the drug hydroxychloroquine. Now, hydroxychloroquine was attacked by the Centers for Disease Control as dangerous, with the claim that it was too dangerous to give people that drug because it might kill them. It has been banned by a number of state governments. Governors and state health authorities have banned the use of hydroxychloroquine for the treatment of COVID-19 in, I think, about 36 or 37 states. In some of those states, doctors who prescribe hydroxychloroquine for the treatment of COVID-19 can lose their license to practice. It's the only medication, according to sources that I've read, where doctors are persecuted for using the medication off-label. That's a common practice where medicines are used by a physician, a licensed physician, for some purpose other than the original purpose for which it was designed. And that happens all the time. With hydroxychloroquine, it's not allowed if you're using it to treat COVID-19 in many jurisdictions. You might ask, why is that? The effectiveness and safety of hydroxychloroquine has been shown in numerous studies and practical experience. Use of hydroxychloroquine for treatment of COVID-19, as I mentioned, is discouraged or banned not only in many of our states, but in most Western democracies. Why? I'll tell you why. It's because of the interest in protecting massive profits for drug companies and their allies. There are forces that are promoting other drugs and vaccines produced by drug companies, and these same forces seek to delegitimize the use of inexpensive treatments proven to work because they stand to lose billions of dollars in profits if these treatments were accepted and widely used. Substances like hydroxychloroquine. That's why. The media is supported by billions of dollars in advertising by drug companies. Government agencies rake in billions of dollars from fees charged to drug companies. The drug companies themselves earn billions of dollars from the production of expensive medicines and vaccines. They don't want a pill that costs a few cents to ruin their opportunity to make a profit. And they don't care how many people die because of their greed. At least 135 studies have been done related to the use of hydroxychloroquine for treating COVID-19 in humans. These studies are analyzed and results published on the website hcqtrial.com. In countries where early treatment with HCQ, as it's called, hydroxychloroquine, in countries where early treatment with HCQ is common, and this would include a number of African countries and other countries in the third world primarily. It's used widely in Africa because malaria is a common disease in Africa, and it's used as an anti-malarial drug. So it's common there and it's commonly available, and it's being used to treat COVID-19 early with the early onset of the disease, as it is in some other areas of the world. In countries where early treatment with HCQ is common, the death rate is only about 26% of the death rate of those countries where HCQ early treatment is limited, and that would include the United States, Great Britain, where it's completely outlawed, from what I understand, and a number of other Western democracies. They review 19 studies involving pre-exposure use of hydroxychloroquine. Positive outcomes were observed in 89% of these studies. They found 3 post-exposure studies. These are studies using the drug and control groups. 3 post-exposure studies were found with 100% positive results when HCQ is administered as a prophylaxis within 4 days or less of exposure. In other words, someone is exposed to the disease, they start taking the hydroxychloroquine within 4 days or less, and there is 100% positive outcome. In these studies, there were 211 high-risk people in hospital after a major exposure event with no positive cases after 14 days. These are high-risk people in a hospital who were exposed, given the drug. There were no cases, no positive cases among these after 14 days. 100% of 24 studies of early treatment with HCQ showed positive results with fewer deaths and faster recovery times than control groups. Even with late treatment with HCQ, which is not recommended, it's recommended you take it as soon as possible after you realize you have been exposed or have the disease. But even with late treatment, they found that 64% of 92 studies showed positive results. Overall, the treatment group in these studies, as opposed to the control groups, the treatment groups had 71.5% fewer deaths. So if you read anywhere that hydroxychloroquine has not been proven to be effective, that is a lie. It has been studied, as we just read, with at least 135 studies. AmericaFrontlineDoctors.com is a group of doctors fighting to make hydroxychloroquine available for use to treat COVID-19 and inform the public about it. They published a white paper available on their website, and they state the following, quote, "This is the culmination of a months-long research from all sources. It explains how Americans have come to be in the grip of fear." That's another factor in this epidemic. There are powerful forces that want to control your life and the lives of every other person on the face of the earth. In order to control you, they need to make you fearful. And a disease epidemic of this kind is the perfect vehicle to spread fear among a population, as it has certainly done, an irrational fear. It says, it explains how Americans have come to be in the grip of fear. All the myths and all the misconceptions about a safe generic drug that has been FDA approved for 65 years, given to pregnant women, breastfeeding women, children, the elderly, and the immune compromised for years and decades without complication, are finally put in the trash heap where they belong. You will have the indisputable proof that you have been massively lied to, and often very intentionally. Doctors James D. Todaro, Joey Krug, Moshe Praver, and Vladimir Zelenko have together published a paper entitled A Two-Step Strategy to Reopen America. In this paper, they state, quote, widespread early treatment with hydroxychloroquine and azithromycin, which is an antibiotic, may reduce the mortality rate by up to 80%. Now, this is something that a number of doctors have been aware of for almost since the inception of this epidemic, and this has been fought tooth and nail by much of the medical establishment, the media, and government. So you can lay the deaths of about 80% of the people who have died to these people that are fighting the use of these commonly available and cheap drugs that could have sliced the death rate by 80%. These people are evil. They're ruthless. And they don't care how many people die. in order to satiate their greed and their other lusts. Ivermectin is another safe and cheap drug that has proven effective against COVID-19. In an article entitled Australian Professor ivermectin, quote, amazingly successful in killing coronavirus, on the website humansarefree.com, August 10th, 2020. This doctor, who is named Thomas Barodi, he's a medical director of Australia's Centre for Digestive Disease. And he states, because I'm involved in developing these in the United States where all the patients are, there are a number of studies that are amazingly successful. We're talking close to 100%. In fact, we haven't seen a result yet under 100%. It looks like corona is very simple to kill. It is very simple to kill if you're using the proper prophylaxis or prophylactic, or if you're taking the proper preventative measures, such as the other things I've mentioned. It is available as a prescription medication. You wouldn't use it alone, but you add two other things to it, such as doxycycline and zinc. Zinc is another antiviral that's quite effective against viruses. So there are a number of measures you can take in godly faith to protect yourself and others from sickness. If you should get sick, you should consider these measures that I've mentioned in addition to prayer. You never forget prayer. You don't leave God out of the picture. You do these things in faith. There's much more that could be done by governments and society as well. Much more that could be done. Unfortunately, many lives are being sacrificed by greedy corporate interests and their allies in government and the media. And this is another reason why we need to pray to God fervently, your kingdom come.